The prayer book, Rebellion of 1549, a forgotten war for faith and language. History remembers great wars and kings, but some of the most powerful stories are about ordinary people who stood up for their beliefs. The prayer book, Rebellion of 1549, was one of those forgotten uprisings where thousands in Cornwall and Devon resisted sweeping religious reforms forced upon them by the English crown. At its heart, it was not just about religion, it was about language, culture, and identity. Imagine being told that your prayers, your faith, and even your native tongue were no longer allowed in church. This rebellion was born from such defiance, and its tragic ending still echoes in modern times. The rebellion began during the reign of young King Edward VI, a period dominated by Protestant reformers eager to reshape English religion. The new Book of Common Prayer, written in English, was imposed on populations who spoke Cornish or were deeply tied to traditional Catholic practices. For Cornwall especially, this was more than a theological shift. It was an attack on their very way of life. It symbolized the erasure of centuries-old traditions and threatened the cultural survival of the Cornish people. What followed was resistance met with brutal suppression. But the Prayer Book Rebellion was not just a regional conflict, it was a microcosm of the broader struggles steering Europe apart during the Reformation. Catholic against Protestant, local tradition against central power, language against uniformity, the rebellion revealed the deep fractures of 16th century society. And while it ended in blood, it left behind lessons on identity, faith, and resilience. This story is one of tragedy, but also of cultural endurance. The leader of the rebellion. The Prayer Book Rebellion, 1549, was led primarily by members of the Cornish and Devon gentry, who rallied local populations against the imposition of the English Book of Common Prayer. The central figure was Humphrey Arundel, a Cornish gentleman who emerged as the rebellion's principal military leader. Arundel was responsible for organizing the rebel forces, coordinating the sieges of towns, and leading the army in several key battles. His leadership gave the uprising structure and direction, turning what might have been sporadic protests into a formidable regional rebellion. Alongside Arundel, other Cornish gentry and local nobles played crucial roles in rallying ordinary villagers and farmers. They helped mobilize militias, secure weapons, and manage supplies for the rebel forces. In Devon, leaders such as Robert Welsh coordinated resistance efforts in their counties and attempted to link up with Cornish forces for a united front. While these figures were less well known than Arundel, their organizational work was essential to the scale and initial success of the uprising. Ultimately, the rebellion's leadership structure combined military command with local influence. Arundel served as the face and strategist of the movement, while other gentry managed regional coordination and recruitment. This allowed the rebellion to spread quickly across Cornwall and Devon, uniting people with a common cause, the defense of faith, language, and tradition. When Arundel was captured and executed in 1550, the movement lost its central figure, and the rebellion collapsed shortly thereafter. Causes of the rebellion. The causes of the Prayer Book Rebellion were rooted in religious, cultural, and political pressures. Chief among them was the introduction of the Book of Common Prayer, which replaced the Latin liturgy with English worship. To many in Cornwall who did not speak English fluently, this was a spiritual and cultural betrayal. The reforms were seen as stripping away centuries of tradition, disconnecting ordinary believers from the rituals they understood. Religion was not abstract theology. It was woven into everyday life, and the changes threatened that foundation. Another key cause was resentment toward the destruction of local religious symbols and practices. The English Reformation under Henry VIII and Edward VI had dissolved monasteries, removed holy images, and dismantled cherished institutions. For rural communities in Cornwall and Devon, this meant not just spiritual loss but also economic hardship, as monasteries had been centers of charity and social stability. The forced pace of reform left little room for dialogue or adjustment. This made resistance not only understandable, but inevitable. Finally, economic and social grievances fed into the rebellion. Heavy taxation, poor harvests, and discontent with local governance created fertile ground for unrest. The imposition of religious reforms became the spark that ignited broader frustrations. Many rebels saw themselves as defending not only their faith, but also their communities from exploitation and neglect. The rebellion was thus both a defense of tradition and a protest against injustice. If you're fascinated by untold stories like this, where faith, culture, and identity collide with power, make sure to like this video and subscribe. We're on a mission to reach more people with forgotten histories, and your support helps keep these stories alive. Course of the rebellion. The rebellion officially began in June 1549, when locals in Devon refused to accept the new English service. Protesters quickly organized, and the unrest spread into Cornwall. Leaders such as Humphrey Arundel took charge, rallying thousands of men to march against the imposition of the prayer book. Their demands included the restoration of the Latin Mass and traditional Catholic practices. The rebellion soon became one of the largest popular uprisings of Tudor England. As the rebels advanced, they gained momentum by capturing towns and blocking royal forces. Their numbers swelled to an estimated 6,000 to 10,000 people at various points. They laid siege to Exeter, a major city in Devon, hoping to force recognition of their cause. The people of Exeter resisted, holding out until royal reinforcements arrived. This stalemate marked a turning point in the conflict, as it drew greater attention from the government in London. Despite their size and passion, the rebels lacked resources and professional training. They were largely peasants and local gentry, facing off against a well-organized royal army. Their demands, rooted in religion and culture, were dismissed as rebellion against royal authority. What began as a defense of faith was increasingly painted as treason. This narrative justified the Crown's brutal response that followed. Key battles and suppression, the decisive battles of the rebellion, were fought in the summer of 1549. At Fenny Bridges, Clyst St. Mary, and Clyst Heath, rebel forces clashed with government troops led by John Russell, the Earl of Bedford. The fighting was fierce, but the rebels were gradually worn down. Despite bravery and determination, they could not withstand the professional soldiers sent against them. By August, the rebellion was crushed in a series of bloody confrontations. One of the most infamous moments came at the Battle of Clyst Heath. After a confrontation, hundreds of captured rebels were massacred by royal troops. This act of brutality shocked even contemporaries, but it showed the government's determination to make an example of the uprising. The suppression was not simply about restoring order, it was about sending a message that resistance to religious reform would not be tolerated. The final blows came as scattered resistance was stamped out across Cornwall and Devon. Villages were burned, rebels executed, and leaders hunted down. Humphrey Arundel, one of the rebellion's central figures, was eventually captured and executed. By autumn of 1549, the rebellion was effectively over. The aftermath would prove even more devastating than the battles themselves. Death toll and manners of death. The Prayer Book Rebellion resulted in catastrophic loss of life. Historians estimate that between 3,000 and 5,500 people were killed during and after the conflict. For a region with relatively small populations, this was an enormous death toll. Entire communities were devastated, with men taken from farms and villages and cut down in battle or execution. The rebellion left scars that would linger for generations. Many of the deaths were not in the heat of battle, but came through deliberate slaughter. Prisoners were executed en masse, most notoriously at Clyst Heath, where hundreds of captives were killed in cold blood. Others were hanged, drawn, and quartered as examples to deter future uprisings. The brutality was disproportionate to the rebellion itself, revealing the government's desire to crush not just resistance, but the very spirit of defiance. Beyond battlefield casualties and executions, famine and disruption followed in the rebellion's wake. Crops went untended, trade suffered, and families were left without providers. The destruction of homes and communities amplified the suffering. In this way, the war was not just a military conflict, but a social disaster that reshaped the lives of ordinary people. Aftermath and consequences, the suppression of the rebellion marked a turning point for Cornwall and Devon. The Crown tightened control, and any hope of religious compromise was extinguished. The Book of Common Prayer remained, and the path of Protestant reform continued. For Catholic loyalists, this was not only a defeat, but a devastating cultural loss. Their spiritual world had been forcibly reshaped by distant authorities. The defeat also accelerated the decline of the Cornish language. Because religious services remained exclusively in English, Cornish worshippers found themselves alienated from their own faith. The inability to pray or hear scripture in their native tongue made religious practice difficult and disheartening. Over time, this contributed to the erosion of Cornish identity. The rebellion's suppression thus had long-lasting cultural as well as religious consequences. Politically, the rebellion reinforced the dangers of defying royal authority. The violence used to suppress it sent a chilling message to other regions. The Tudors proved that they would tolerate no challenge to their religious reforms, no matter how rooted in local tradition. This established a precedent for harsh crackdowns in later uprisings. It was a warning written in blood. Impact on modern Cornwall and England. The rebellion's legacy is still visible in modern Cornwall and Devon. It is remembered as a moment when ordinary people stood up for their faith, their traditions, and their language. For many, it represents the tragic price of cultural suppression. The Cornish language, which suffered heavily after 1549, has only recently begun to revive in modern times. The rebellion is often cited as a turning point in its decline. In broader English history, the Prayer Book Rebellion highlights the dangers of imposing reform without sensitivity to local identity. It showed that religious and cultural change cannot be enforced by decree without risking backlash. The rebellion remains a case study in how language, culture, and faith intertwine with politics. Modern movements for cultural preservation in Cornwall often look back to 1549 as a rallying point. It is both a tragedy and a source of inspiration. Even today, the rebellion shapes how Cornwall views its place within England. The sense of being distinct, of having a unique cultural and historical heritage, is tied in part to this uprising. Remembering the events of 1549 is not only about honoring the dead, it is about understanding how cultural identity survives oppression. The Prayer Book Rebellion may have been crushed, but its spirit endures. The Prayer Book Rebellion was more than a local uprising. It was a clash of culture, faith, and power. It revealed the struggles of ordinary people caught in the tide of sweeping religious reforms. And though it ended in bloodshed, it left behind lessons that still resonate today. The rebellion stands as both a warning and a testament to the resilience of culture under pressure. When we look at history, we often focus on kings, queens, and battles. But the Prayer Book Rebellion reminds us that history is also about ordinary people defending what they believe in. Their voices may have been silenced in the 16th century, but their story still speaks today. If you found this story compelling, don't let it fade into obscurity. Like, share, and subscribe to help us uncover more forgotten histories that shaped our world. Together, we can keep these stories alive for future generations.